Hi there. Don't mind me. I'm just catching up on some old Autocar India history. This is the May 2013 issue and it contains our road test of the first Honda Amaze. And I remember contributing to this story. You see, we drove this car quite extensively back then and we came away rather impressed by a couple of things, particularly the space and the fuel economy. But that was 5 years ago. And now, since then, the competition has moved well ahead. There's no more time for updates and facelifts. There's time for an all-new car. So say hello, everyone, to the brand new 2018 Honda Amaze. But first, let's look at the old car to see how much has changed. With the last Amaze, Honda took its small Brio hatchback and stretched it as much as they could within a 4-meter limit to maximize interior room. Trouble is, the droopy nose didn't look so good on a sedan, and the space-efficient cab-forward shape made it look a bit bulbous. Now the new Amaze doesn't have that problem because, of course, there is no new Brio for it to be based on. It is a design all of its own. The car has grown in length and in width. The length is only 5 millimeters longer than before, but the wheelbase is a full 65 millimeters longer than it used to be, and that really shows in the car's stance. To make it look more like a conventional sedan, the bonnet is longer and taller, and it's tipped forward like a shark's nose. At the sides, you now get one strong shoulder line and a roofline that extends far back. The bigger 15-inch wheels look good, and though the tail is still quite stubby, the tail lamps that extend into the boot lid give it some character. So whether you like the shape or not, the old car did allow for a lot of space in the back seat. So what's the new car like on that front? Now, backseat space was always a Honda Amaze hallmark, and things have only gotten better this time around, thanks to that 65mm longer wheelbase. In fact, Honda says there's 25mm more space between the front seat and the back seat, and they've done that also by moving the back seat a little bit further behind. Now, legroom as a result is quite phenomenal for a car of this size. Headroom is okay. I'm 5'7" and a bit, and I figure taller passengers might have a little harder time. Thigh support is actually pretty good, and Honda has even managed to fit 2 cup holders and very large bottle holders in the doors. However, the rear headrests are still fixed, and there are still no rear AC vents. So they've managed to keep the back seat spacious, but what does that mean for the boot space? Let's quickly go check that out. Now, the old Amaze, when it was new, had a class-leading 400 liters of boot space, and that number held strong right through its life cycle. The new one has a class-leading 420 liters of space. Now, it can take a big suitcase, I'm sure, but right now you have my trolley bag for reference to see how much room there is in there. It's quite impressive for a sub-4-meter sedan, and, well, that just goes to show the boot space is big, the back seat is big, but one thing that is completely new from the old Amaze is the front seat. So let me just quickly show you what that's like. Now, boy oh boy, is this a pleasant surprise. Our biggest criticism of the old Amaze was that the interior just didn't feel special or premium enough, and they've done wonders to fix that. For one, there's this nice piano black finish over here on the dashboard, and yes, some of the plastics are still hard plastics, but they're very good quality hard plastics, so it doesn't look or feel too bad. There's a nice dual tone color scheme, and yes, there are a few odd switches here and there that don't feel quite as good, but on the flip side, there are some really nicely damped switches like these aircon controls over here. Overall, the old quality standard that we used to love about Hondas does seem to be making a comeback. There are some nice details like the crisp new dials with the informative trip computer screen between them, the dual USB ports up front, and the huge storage bins in the doors. We particularly like the front seats, which are much better cushioned and which feature adjustable headrests this time around. Now, where the old Amaze wasn't too well equipped, this one is much more in sync with the segment. The top spec VX cars get a touchscreen with Apple CarPlay, Android Auto and navigation, a rear camera and sensors, and keyless entry and go. However, it doesn't get auto headlamps and wipers like some rivals, and projector LED headlamps would have added some premium feel. Now, I may have started out in the manual car, but I quickly changed over to this one, the diesel auto. This diesel CVT is a first for the segment and for Honda. So what's it like? The first thing you should know, however, is that this car has slightly less power and torque than the manual version. So instead of 200 Newton meters, it's 160 Newton meters, and instead of 100 horsepower, it's 80 horsepower. The reason Honda cut the power and torque was to make it smoother in practice. If there was too much torque, the CVT would just slip and it would cause a very jerky and uncomfortable movement. So by reducing the torque, they allow it to be a lot smoother. So how does it feel out in the real world? Honestly, not too bad. It has its pros and its cons. For one, if you put your foot down really hard, you get that rubber band effect typical of a CVT, and because this is a diesel, already a noisy diesel, it only amplifies the sound as the revs build without matching acceleration. That can be a little bit frustrating. You can get better responses by putting the CVT in sport mode, but this also locks the revs at around 2000 RPM, and that means more engine noise more of the time. Also, while the petrol CVT gets paddle shifters, there's no manual control of any sort for the diesel CVT. On the flip side, because it has 160 Newton meters of torque, which may be less than the diesel manual, but it's still quite a bit more than the petrol, you always have a nice strong reserve of thrust available, so you never really have to push this car too hard at all. It's great for relaxed driving, and as long as you keep a light foot on the throttle, progress is very, very smooth indeed. So as with any CVT, it's best used in the city, but the advantage of this diesel one is that it has a strong enough torque reserve that if you wanted to use it out on the highway, you still can. This CVT variant is not available in the top end VX trim, and this one right here is a V trim, and that means you miss out on cruise control amongst other things, and you miss out on that great AVN touchscreen. Still, we feel Honda is onto something big with this CVT diesel. It has a smoothness you'd expect from a premium car, and with the promise of good fuel economy too, it seems like a match made in heaven. We also drove the petrol manual, and to get a feel for the dynamics, we took it to someplace special, Nandi Hills. The engine is, as before, a 1.2 litre 4-cylinder naturally aspirated petrol engine, which makes 90 horsepower and 110 Newton meters of torque. And just as before, it's got a bit of pep low down, and it's got a lot of pep past 5000 RPM all the way to the 6500 RPM red line. It really loves to be revved. But it's also got that same weakness of a slightly flat mid-range, so that in between phase between about 2000 and 4500 RPM, well, it doesn't get a move on as nicely as you'd like. So on to the dynamics, and there's a lot to talk about because this is an entirely new chassis underneath the new Amaze. The new chassis is stiffer and lighter, but that's not all. It's got a longer wheelbase and wider front and rear track, so it's got a bigger footprint on the road, and that means more grip. And this means you get a lot more confidence going around corners than you did in the old car. However, they've also dialed in some slack to the steering at the straight ahead position, and while that makes it less edgy to drive, it's also lost some of that sharpness as a result. But it still feels better to steer than many of its rivals. The new suspension has imbued the Amaze with a ride quality the old car couldn't even dream of. It's got this big car maturity to the way it rides. It absorbs bumps just so well, and it's actually quite a revelation if you ever driven the old car. And this hasn't come at the expense of highway stability, because when you're out at 3-digit speeds, it stays quite flat even over undulations. They've really nailed it this time around. And having tested a variety of new Amazes on a variety of roads in a variety of weather conditions, it was time to head back and try and put this new compact sedan into perspective. Now, if there's one way to sum up the new Amaze, it's grown up. And I don't mean that just in terms of size and space. It really has grown up in just about every measure from the first generation to the second. It looks a lot more mature for one. The interiors are much better put together and much better equipped. It drives a lot more maturely now, and the ride is something out of a much bigger, more expensive car. The real feather in its cap, however, is the diesel CVT variant, which works really well and should stand it in good stead against its competition. Now, all that's remaining is the price, and we'll find that out in the first half of May. So let's hope Honda gets that right, because if they do, they have another winner on their hands.